Thank you for joining us. This is the Psychological and Social Issues panel. And I'm Greg Payton. You've probably already heard me talk a little bit today. And I'm just going to introduce Mary Riddle and Jen Rahman, who are here to offer up their perspectives on psychological and social issues. I'm going to let them do the bulk of the talking. We're going to try and make this as conversational as possible so that we can maybe focus more on answering some of your questions. But I'll just say really briefly about myself. As I mentioned in the earlier forum, I'm a gay dad of 2 kids. One's 2.5, one's 4 months. We had 2 gestational surrogacy experiences, both with the same egg donor and with the same surrogate. I'm also clinical psychologist here in the city. So I have a small practice, and a good part of my practice is working with, hi, welcome. A good part of my practice is working with individuals and couples pursuing surrogacy. And I'm also faculty at Columbia and do some research related to this area. So I'm happy to kind of answer maybe some questions or talk a little bit about my personal experience as well as maybe some of my kind of professional experiences. But now I just want to introduce Dr. Mary Riddle.
Hi, everybody. I was going to talk about, I'm a clinical psychologist. I live in central Pennsylvania. I teach and do research at Penn State, and I have a private practice that's devoted to all issues in reproductive health. So I do psychological evaluations of primarily gestational carriers. And I was going to talk for a few minutes and then answer any questions you might have about starting to think about the relationship that you would have with a surrogate, both preconception throughout the surrogacy journey. And I thought I would just say a little bit about that and a little bit about what we know about carriers and their motivations for becoming carriers, because I think that really impacts how they think about having a relationship with intended parents. When I do a psychological evaluation, one of the primary points that I want to discuss with them is, why do they want to be a carrier? Why do they want to be a surrogate? And it needs to be more than whatever financial compensation they would get. It needs to be a meaningful experience in her life. She should have a compelling reason for wanting to be a surrogate. The research into this, which really mirrors my clinical experience, is that the primary motivation for many surrogates is this desire to do something important in their life. And I would add to that for many of them, there's a religious component. There's a feeling of being called to do this, a feeling of having been so blessed with their own family that they feel that they're meant to do something important, and that would be to help someone else create their family. So one of the things that we do know about carriers and their desire for a relationship, comes out of these motivational factors. We know that carriers it's very important to them that the intended parents that they're matched with, act like parents during the pregnancy and are concerned about their well-being. And for most of them, I can say really from a clinical standpoint, often when I'm evaluating them, I always talk to them about, well, what do you want the relationship to look like? How do you see it? What are your thoughts about the type of contact you'd like to have during a pregnancy? What do you see the relationship looking like after? And sometimes they're hesitant to discuss it because often they really want to be a surrogate, and I think they're afraid sometimes if they have strong feelings about it, they might not get chosen or something like that. But I really encourage them to think about it and to talk about it and not to be afraid to express their feelings about what they want the relationship to look like, because that's going to really lead to the best match, because what everyone wants is a good match and open communication, and the more we know about how they feel about what it looks like, and what you want it to look like, then that's going to be the best match. And the only other thing I would say is just to be thinking about a few things is, ideally prior to conception, you would have a joint meeting with a mental health professional and the carrier where you would talk through a lot of different issues that are going to minimize the risk of miscommunication, because that's really the most important thing. I say put everything out there ahead of time, talk through all the worst case scenarios, because everyone wants a positive outcome. So I just jotted down a few things that you might talk about in that preconception meeting, which would be motivations on both sides, the reactions of family and friends, both your family and friends and their support system, and how people feel about the fact that you've decided to do this and that they've decided to do this. Prenatal care preferences, religious and cultural differences, prenatal testing, and the types of decisions that one has to make throughout a pregnancy, and what that looks like for you, and how they feel about it and think about it. And again, I would say, one of the primary things you want to talk about is the contact between families during a pregnancy and after a pregnancy. Research shows that over long term, the majority of relationships remain positive. Many intended families stay in touch with their surrogates. Certainly the amount varies, and I think it varies based on the type of relationship you have. But that's, I can talk and talk and talk, but you can ask questions after Jen gets a chance to talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so now I'd like to just introduce Jen Rahman, who's with Circle Surrogacy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Rahman. I'm a social worker with Circle. Also, it's an intended parent, a former intended parent, now parent, through surrogacy and egg donation. And after my son was born, I started doing work for Circle in the New York area. So my role is really to be here and kind of on a little bit of the opposite side. I work mainly with IPs and helping them learn about this process, help them think about if they feel emotionally ready to embark on this journey and what that entails, and educate about what does a surrogacy process look like from start to finish, so that you can understand and conceptualize something that I understand, feel so foreign initially, and then the idea of these women that come into your life, and how do you envision connecting with them, and help you start to think about. I like to think of our conversations. Circle, we offer free consultations, so at any point if anyone wants to pick my brain and just have an open conversation about how do I envision myself engaging with these two women that are going to come into my life, that are going to play such monumental roles, and that the relationships are different. With an egg donor, it's a short-term engagement rather than a long-term, but then to some people that has a greater bearing on who their child will be, so that carries more weight. Whereas the surrogate, you're engaging with her at least a year throughout your experience, and how do you envision that relationship being? And everyone, I feel, comes into this thinking it will be one way, and maybe it stays that way, but I think people are often surprised. Everyone has a different feeling about what will it mean to connect with these two women. So part of my role is to talk about you and who you are and your own supports, whether you are coupled, whether you're a single parent, looking at your own life, who in your world is there to support you as you go on through this process. And then also to educate about what are our surrogates and our egg donors, what did they go through, and help you better understand what you hope to get out of this process. I know we spoke a little bit about earlier on what surrogates need to go through to come into the program, what our donors could do through to come into the program. And I could speak a little bit to how they're screened and what their process is, so that we can understand, and this is a lot of what Mary does in her work, is screening these women and making sure that each party, you as the IPs and your surrogate primarily, that you each have supports in place as you're moving forward. Because as much as we want your process to be from point A to point B, from getting started to birth of baby, we want it to be a straight path. It's not always a straight path. And to what Mary said earlier about communication being key, the key foundation, and having a connectedness so that everyone's on the same page. I call it front loading, when we talk about things ahead of time, so that people are prepared for scenarios that you hope don't happen. You don't want them to happen, but they can happen, and it's always good to talk about and have an openness ahead of time rather than deal with them at should they arise. just to give a little rundown on what we do at Circle in terms of screening our surrogates and what their process looks like when they come into the program. Because I know for myself, I had like, who are these women? Where are they coming from? Why do they want to do this? What is their motivation? So that's part of our role is as your agency is to engage and figure out why would they make a good surrogate. So just to give a quick rundown, for Circle, it starts with an online questionnaire, which actually rules out about half the applicants. Women have to be, their baseline criteria has to be they have to have had a healthy, successful pregnancy. That has to be, we don't take a chance on somebody that we don't know that they're not only physically capable of carrying a pregnancy, but that emotionally they understand what that entails to go through that process. So the online questionnaire actually rules out about half our applicants. They have to be from surrogacy-friendly states, for example. That's another initial question that comes up. Once they get past the questionnaire, we do a medical history review, looking at her pregnancy history to make sure it truly was healthy. And then from there, she gets involved with our support staff. She meets with a social worker. Why are you doing this? What is your motivating factor? How do you see yourself engaging with the IPs? How do you see yourself connecting with this pregnancy as different to your own pregnancies? Conversations we have with her right from the get-go, educating her about what it looks like to go through this. We take a side step that I really like and actually also interview who's her support person. Is it a spouse, a family member, a friend, a partner? Who is that go-to person that's your main person in this process for you? And we interview them as well, which I know other agencies don't always take the time to do that, but I really like that as an IP that I not only when I looked at her packet initially, I saw not only a write-up about her, but also reflecting on her support person, which was really nice. From there, she moves on to a psychologist who does an MMPI, a basic a personality disorder assessment. Maybe you could speak to that, Mary, what that entails. Kind of gives her a psychological approval that she's ready to go into this type of process. And our last steps are a criminal and a financial background check. So we're looking at this as she doesn't have a criminal history, and then also that they're self-sufficient in their own income, so that the money is not the main motivating factor. And we were just chatting about this earlier, how money, it just can't be the only motivating factor. I think a lot of people come into this. I know I had. Are they just doing it for the money? How big of a motivator is the money in all of this? And part of our assessment is really to look at, make sure that they are whatever the level of income they might have. I think they have to be above the nation's. They can't be below the nation's poverty line, which I believe is about $34,000 for a family unit, which sounds like peanuts compared to us in New York. What that means, but also remember. They're typically from suburban to rural areas. Money goes a lot further, a different way of life, different perspective of things. So all those steps go into screening a carrier before we would even chat with you as an IP about this woman. So a lot of I know as an IP concerns I had about their readiness, knowing and trusting that they've been through all these steps already before they're even spoken to about a potential match, definitely made me feel more comfortable as an IP. So our role is really to get involved and make sure, again, that they are ready, but also what do you hope to get out of this process? How do you hope to connect with your surrogate? Communication and relationships, Circle's kind of foundation is based in relationships. We want you to engage with her. We have a stipulation in our contract that just says you'll have weekly contact. We like it to be through phone or Skype. We don't like texting and emailing to replace actual human contact. So even if she's across the country, like my surrogate is from Utah. I live here, she's from Utah. It's quite far. So it was nice to know that the agency set a framework that we followed, and it actually made perfect sense. We had a weekly Skype time, that's what worked best for us, where we know we get to see her and talk to her and know how she's doing. And I think that creates a healthy dynamic right from the get-go. We want that communication to start, not waiting until she's pregnant. It should start right from your match, so that you can start knowing who she is and why she's doing this and engaging with her and supporting her as she's going through it. Support is on both sides of this journey. We have support. We have a social work team that works with our intended parents as they're in their process, but also providing support for the surrogates as they're going through their journeys. Facebook, I know it's like, everyone's on Facebook. Facebook, we've created forums, closed forums on Facebook so that the surrogates can connect with one another. So even if they're not in close proximity where they can sit down and have a conversation with the surrogate, that they have the ability to engage with one another and have that camaraderie of someone else that's going through this piece as well. So just to speak about support being so important for yourselves as you're going through, and also for your surrogate to make sure that she has the right supports in place so that she can feel comfortable as everyone moves through together. I'm kind of going on some tangents. Sorry.
No, this is really helpful. So, the intention behind this panel today was to really talk about psychological and social issues from 3 different perspectives. One is the intended parent perspective, and how to sort of best think about your own mental health, your own psychological health as you go through this process, as an individual or as a couple. The second is from the surrogate's perspective. How do we best support surrogates through this process? And then the third, which may not be on your radar right now, but the third is sort of what are the long-term effects of surrogacy on kids. We have a lot of men at these events who are very curious about, what does this kind of new family constellation, how does that impact kids in terms of their outcomes? So we're here to talk about all those perspectives. But I wonder, just based on kind of what you've said so far, Jen, I wonder if maybe you could say a little bit about when you're talking to intended parents, what do you see as some of maybe the biggest stressors or psychological elements that you kind of work through on a regular basis? And Mary, from your perspective, kind of working predominantly with surrogates, both in terms of your research and your clinical expertise, what do you see as some of the biggest kind of psychological stressors and most effective ways of coping with those? Either of you want to begin?
I think it's so, I love when I sit down with an IP, from the get-go, because everyone, I think, in some degree has some similarities in what their fears are and what their worries are and what they, the worst case scenarios of things that can happen. Like, how many times people say to me, like, is she going to want to keep my child? Like, is that actually going to happen? And my answer is no. Circle's been doing this a long time. We've never had a woman actually want to keep the child. That doesn't happen. That's a lot of sensational media exposure that kind of leads to that fear. But that's not in actuality. So I think there's a lot of some irrational fears that come in that are not really based on what actually happens. There's so much work that goes into the screening of the surrogates and the engagement and the communication and the contract that really, all this talk in the beginning phases is what will prevent those types of things from happening. To make sure that she really understands what this will mean for her to go through this, and the idea of carrying a child for somebody else and handing their child over to them at birth, and her being emotionally ready for that. So I think a lot of IPs come in and they have questions about that, her emotional readiness. Is she going to be able to do this? She can be able to separate from, her own children and my child. I think there's a lot of, fears and worries about what is it going to be like to engage with her. This is kind of a weird dynamic and a weird relationship. It's not like a friend that you just a friendship that you naturally form. It's not family. It's kind of this strange unto its own relationship for you to really create and define together. But we talk about what will that relationship look like, and I said before about the weekly engagement, talking to her weekly, but also people will say, how is our relationship going to feel afterwards? What is it going to be like once my child's born? Okay, I can understand communicating with her and supporting her throughout, but then when my child's born, it's our child, and how's that separation going to feel? And part of our work is really to help you prepare for that transition that happens. And even though it might not be a goodbye when your child's born, we hope it's not a goodbye, but if it's the ending to this process together, and then how will you then redefine or recreate what that relationship is with her after the fact? And we can't insist upon that. That's for you to figure out. I always tell people that on one extreme, some people have absolutely no contact with their surrogates after. On the opposite extreme, people have family holidays together and family vacations together, and those are really minorities, and really big extremes. Most people are falling somewhere in between that spectrum, and that's for you to really define and figure out. We can't insist upon that as your agency, and really, it's hard to say when you don't even know this woman yet. You don't even know what it's going to feel like to talk to, you might connect so wonderfully well with her. that you might want to have that level of closeness. I think of most of our contacts probably through texting and or Facebook, and sending pictures and seeing how she's doing. We've Skyped a couple of times, I think, since my son was born. If you think about it, probably it's only been like 3 or 4 times in 3 years, so it's not a lot. But I always send her a holiday basket around the holidays for her and her kids. I always send her flowers on Mother's Day. These are things that are important to me, to always acknowledge what she has done for us. I don't ever want that to go forgotten, or that she doesn't think that I'm, thinking of her. But it's by no means the same. I think of her as almost like a distant family member, someone that I have great appreciation and admiration and love for. And I know I can pick up the phone at any point and call her and how are you doing? But she's not in my everyday world. She's not, it's us as a family, and there's definitely that that separation that occurs at the end. So that those are some of the topics that I hear come up quite a bit over, what's that going to look like, and how do I connect with her during, but then also what will it be like down the road.
Thank you so much. And Mary.
Yeah, and I would add, I just was thinking as Jen was talking, some of the anxiety I think that intended parents can feel through the pregnancy has to do with the fact that there's a little bit of a loss of control as to what happens during the pregnancy. This woman could potentially be living far away, and often, and this is what I was thinking was sort of unique, in heterosexual couples, they're typically coming to surrogacy after years, perhaps, of profound loss, not being able to have a baby themselves. So, there often can be, with intended moms, a tremendous amount of anxiety because what she has to grieve and kind of accept moving into a surrogacy arrangement is going to be different. But I still see with same-sex couples, this idea like, is she taking care of herself? And sometimes people can get worked up. They want to make sure she's eating right, and how do we know she's taking her prenatal vitamins? And
how do we know she's not having a sip of whiskey every now and again? Like how do we know she's not drinking alcohol?
And often they'll have, and I think this differs between agencies. If you're going through a lawyer, there's so many different variations. Sometimes some agencies will, insist upon a home visit. I do home visits sometimes. It's not always required. If it's a particular concern, then it's certainly something you could ask for and request, because sometimes that eases a little bit of the anxiety. At least, her house is safe and she's okay and nobody's smoking and things like that. But my research, most of my research has come out of really my clinical experience. So I do evaluations on carriers and their spouses. So when I do a psychological evaluation, I meet with both of them, typically the carrier and either her partner or spouse, significant other, because I really want to they're included. I need to know how they're doing too, and see if there's any concerns there, and also to see what the level of support is and make sure they understand, your role may change significantly if we have a pregnancy where it's a multiple, or what if your wife goes on bed rest, you're going to have to step up and take care of the kids, and what does that look like? And I do psychological testing and various things trying to assess their psychological appropriateness. But out of that work, part of what I do with them is to discuss with them, well, how are you going to manage this in your family system? How are you going to share this with your children? What's that going to look like? What's their understanding of it? Because if you think about it, particularly with small children, a surrogate is pregnant, and what a child sees is mommy's having a baby and she's going to give it to somebody else. And what if she does that? If I'm naughty, is she going to give me away too? So I talk with them a lot about how they're going to manage the information in their system. So that led me to my current research, which has been looking at the psychological well-being of surrogates' own children. And I really have found some interesting things on, standardized measures. Everybody's doing great. But on what we call qualitative data, on sort of open-ended questions, how did you feel about this? How do you feel about the fact that your mom's a surrogate? Some of the kids had really strong emotional feelings about it. Some were angry that that their mom didn't tell them before she got pregnant. Some of them were sad and saw it as a loss, that they wanted a brother or sister and they weren't going to have a brother or sister. Some of them were anxious. Well, what happens to the baby? Are we going to see it again? So I think about that a lot when I'm working with carriers. And the other thing that I found that was really interesting is little to none of the carriers themselves perceived that their children had any negative feelings about it. And I think from a clinical standpoint, I experienced that too. You know, carriers really want to be carriers. I mean, why would you do this unless you had a profound desire to do this? And so it's easy to make assumptions. Well, if I want to do it, of course everybody's fine with it. You know, my husband's fine with it. Oh, the kids love the fact that I did this, you know, which may or may not be true. But I think as intended parents, you have to consider that as well, that's part of the communication is, you know, how's the whole family doing? Because really, I think this is an event, certainly for her family, that's a profound event in her own family. And I do think it impacts how she thinks about, well, what's, you know, I genuinely think there's a desire to maintain a relationship, that her children would have some awareness of this child. You know, it's part of what makes it such a big decision all the way through, is all these various considerations that you have to think about.
Thank you both. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and so I just want to say one very brief thing about the third piece, which is, you know, what do we know about the long-term kind of outcomes for kids through surrogacy? Meaning, you know, for all of you who are going to have a kid in a couple of years, what's their life going to be like? What are they going to be like 10, 15, 20 years from now? And, you know, we were talking earlier that there's very little research right now into, that gives us a lot of evidence about what happens to kids down the road, mostly because surrogacy is just, for gay men, is so new. The medical and legal advancements, frankly, are just so recent that we don't have cohorts of kids who are 15, 20, 30 years out from now. But we do have a lot of comparative research looking at other family constellations. So through adoption, through foster care, through single parents, through lesbian parents predominantly. Lesbians have been at this longer than most gay men have been at this. And what we know is that across the board, you know, these kids are turning out just as well as similarly positioned peers, right? So when you kind of control for things, particularly like class and level of education of the parents, we find that kids pretty much turn out the same. And I know for me, as a psychologist who was approaching this process, I of course wanted to do like all the research and figure out how I'm going to already mess up my kids before they're even born by going through this process. And I was really comforted to know, and we highly recommend Susan Gollenbach's book, which is out there for purchase at the book table, called Modern Families. But what we know from all of this research so far is that there are basically, you know, these 4 characteristics that result in good outcomes for kids, regardless of the family structure. And they are empathy, responsivity, some kind of warmth, quality of warmth, and also wantedness. And actually what a lot of research finds is that for gay men, this wantedness piece is off the charts, right? Because you really have to want this if you're a gay man. This doesn't happen accidentally. And so what actually some studies are preliminarily finding is that there actually can be higher outcomes for children of surrogacy through, for gay men, because that level of wantedness is so strong. So I'm happy to talk more about kind of my perspective, both as a professional and personally. And I know that both Jen and Mary are happy to elaborate on anything they've mentioned so far. But now we'd really just like to turn over to you all and invite any questions that you have, maybe questions that you were reluctant to ask in the larger forum, and we want to reassure you that no question is inappropriate. So please feel free to take a risk with your questions.
I have a question. I've thought about this for a while, and I just want to know your thoughts on it. I know keeping the surrogacy but the gene pool within family and being 2 men, have you come across people who have used their siblings as the donor, egg donor, and one of us are the sperm donor? And surrogacy, and how does that work psychologically? What are the statistics afterwards, and the sister's involvement, and what have you come across in that?
Yes. All of those combinations. One thing that I think in particular is important for gay men is the discussion around if one of you is going to provide the sperm, which one. There was a time where, and maybe some people still do this, although as mental health professionals we kind of recommend against it, and that was mixing sperm. Some guys would go, can we just throw it all in a petri dish and whatever happens, happens. But we didn't feel like that was such a great idea for a lot of reasons. One is, very practically down the line, there might be medical reasons that you would need to know who the genetic father was. And I guess I sort of feel like there was something something unresolved in not really making a decision as to who it would be. So that's a couple's issue, and sometimes maybe a man has a child from another relationship, so the other one, or one of them's older or younger. So that's one piece. Using family, we call them known donors, is certainly, there's, sister to sister egg donation, sister to brother. Obviously you couldn't use your sister's egg and your sperm, but there is going to be a mental health process to that. The egg donors are going to undergo a psychological evaluation, and there's just going to be a lot. It's a little more complex. Just if you think about in terms of disclosure, what is this child going to know about their genetic parents? We really strongly recommend that you don't keep secrets in the family, that these things are open. What's that relationship going to look like? That perhaps a family member doesn't feel obligated. We want to make sure that, that the donor doesn't feel compelled to do it because it's family. So there's all these sort of layers, but yes, that certainly happens, and happens quite frequently, and there's positive outcomes, but there will be an assessment process, and sometimes it isn't appropriate for various psychological reasons that would only come out through the process, but that is certainly something that happens, and has to start kind of with a discussion within the couple about what your thoughts are about potential donors, because many people, it's very important to them that the genetic tie remains, and that feels comfortable and good to them.
I've heard that come up quite a bit. People will come, whether it's a sibling or a close friend that I think is wonderful, and they would absolutely love to grab her genetics and have that be the genetic mother. But I often encourage people to take a step back and think about not only the familial, the comfort in having that connectivity, but also think about boundaries, in terms of what is your relationship like with this person. It's not, when you're choosing a donor who's unknown to you initially, you can then create how much or if you engage with her. But when it's someone that's already in your life, whether it's a family member or a friend, then you're redefining things a bit, and that can be great. And so it can cause some tension or concerns or worries. And
they'll be in the child's life too. That
Right.
child is going to have a relationship with this family member. Is that in the best interest of the child and other family members? So
it's definitely a conversation that we have, encouraging you to think about what would that shift in that relationship be like for you, and talking about that. And yes, a mental health perspective, evaluating and making sure that everyone really understands, and potentially some counseling together. If it's a sibling, what will that mean for all of us to embark on this together? Because then you're adding elements of other family members being involved, as opposed to just being you yourself or you as a couple. Something to think about.
Yeah, the only thing I'd briefly add to this is just that I think those decision points, my recommendation both personally and professionally would also be that those decision points are handled in the same way that you would make other decisions, and namely that you're doing so really transparently, really with a high level of communication with these people, and also that you're not doing it with cost as the motivating factor. So like if you're thinking about using an egg donor who's a sibling because you want to reduce cost, or as a surrogate because you want to reduce cost, I would really just caution anyone who's doing that to think more deeply about, the impact of those choices.
There's something you're struggling with that you want to communicate to your surrogate, but you're not quite sure how to bring it up. You have the opportunity to engage with your social worker and chat with, how do I bring this up to her? Is this going to be awkward? What do I say to her? You can have that type of feedback. And similarly on her side, are there things that were coming up for her within her own family? I mean, she's a person.
Mm-hmm.
She's not living in an isolated bubble. So is she, things that came up, I heard someone, the surrogate's mom passed away while she was pregnant. So she was clearly emotionally distressed. It was, not anticipated. So, real life things can happen to her in her pregnancy, and we want to make sure that she has those supports in place too. So, to make sure each party really has those supports in place to hold, I feel is just really important throughout. The agency can act as a middleman. But we would rather not. We would rather feel like you can communicate what you need to with her. We can coach you on that and guide you and give you some support and advice around that.
And just to that point, Men Having Babies is developing an ethical framework for helping intended parents to kind of make ethical decisions along the way of their journey. And part of that process involved feedback from surrogates who gave us feedback on the document that we were creating. And one of the biggest pieces where they gave feedback was in this psychosocial support piece, and saying that they felt strongly that whether it's agencies or couples or others involved in the process should be more attentive to the psychosocial piece. So it's a really important piece that I think sometimes gets kind of bumped to the back of the legal decisions and the medical decisions.
Yes.
But the psychosocial piece is what quickly comes to the foreground when everything's now happening.
And I would say, as a therapist, that I often will recommend in my psych report for the carrier, if I feel like she is appropriate as a carrier, however, because of her history, she's going to need some psychological support through the pregnancy. I would say the same for any couple that's going through this, having someone that you can talk to who understands this process at different points in the process, where you two can talk to each other, but also to a professional about stuff, because just stuff comes up, It's life and stuff comes up, and it's nice to talk with somebody or to have a go-to person that, you can just talk it through, who understands kind of what it's like.
Yeah. Other questions?
I guess kind of in line with that is, did you encounter any unforeseen medical problems or issues during, your experience, and how did you handle that? And who is the support when something like that comes up?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were very fortunate. We didn't have any medical setbacks. We had two journeys with the same surrogate, and both were successful on the first transfer. So we didn't even have the experience of losing maybe a transfer, which happens commonly. And so we were really fortunate in that regard. But, a lot of, I think, our stress as maybe the type A people that we are, my husband and I, was actually kind of preparing for this process and going through all these decision points. Would we selectively reduce, for instance? If we transferred 2 embryos and we have multiples, would we consider reducing? Under what circumstances would we agree to terminate the pregnancy completely? With the egg donor selection, what are the characteristics that we're looking for? And so a lot of that was both kind of looking to one another for support, but what I found in my circle of friends is that no one else in my circle of friends had gone through surrogacy. And I have actually found that in the gay community, there can be people who kind of look at you like, wait, you want to, do what the straight people are doing, and I don't get this, and I'm not really connected to that, so I can't really be there for you. So I think it's really only through organizations like Men Having Babies that I'm able to find, or I was able to find allies and find that support. So I think in general, a lot of men turn to organizations like this. But for men who are maybe going through this process in rural or suburban areas or parts of the country where it's less common, it can be very isolating, and that you may turn to maybe some online forums. There are lots of support groups out there that take that form. But I do see, both in my clinical practice and my personal experience, the great benefit of working with a professional who's going to support you and also maybe help you kind of keep thinking about things that maybe you don't want to think about, because it's hard to think about. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that.
Well,
too.
I'm just thinking of a couple of scenarios where medical things did come up, and it can be, I mean, sometimes I tell both intended parents that I talk to and carriers, part of my job is kind of just to think of the absolute worst case scenarios so that you've thought about them, and I'm thinking, I mean, very interestingly, there was a surrogacy scenario that I was asked to consult on because the surrogate had had a miscarriage. She had gotten pregnant and she had had a miscarriage. And she was so completely devastated, more than the intended parents were upset, but she was almost inordinately upset. But what was kind of interesting about it is because, many surrogates, they feel like this is what they do best. They get pregnant easily, they love being pregnant, they've completed their families, but they love being pregnant so much they want to have it again but not take care of another child. And for her, it was such a sense of personal failure, one that she had disappointed the intended parents, but she had just never failed at this. This had been what she did better than anything, and finding really all of them support. And I certainly have seen, sadly, sometimes medical things come up, serious medical things with the baby. So you want to kind of think about it, I think, before going into it. Like, let's just think of everything that can go wrong, and what are we going to do? Because in all likelihood, it's not going to happen, but if it does, at least you've kind of thought about, because when couples don't, that's when I think it really can be even doubly stressful, when it never occurred to them that something could go really wrong.
I think that we're out of time, but I want to invite you maybe to offer a final comment to this question or to anything else that you'd like to elaborate.
I think all the points around talking about things ahead of time, together as a couple, talking with your supports, thinking about all the possible scenarios. And I've heard all sorts of questions. I've heard all sorts of anxieties and fears and worries. There's nothing that's out of the realm of, like, that sounds like a crazy or stupid question. No, I mean, there's a lot of factors in this process that you have a lot of ducks to put in a row. So you have to really feel as comfortable as you possibly can going in. So, I just encourage people to have those conversations with each other, with your supports, with people around you, with organizations like Men Having Babies, with agencies, whomever you need to have those conversations with.
So unfortunately, I have to quickly end, but thank you all so much for attending today. If you have any additional questions, please contact us. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.